The most disturbing last wishes of death row inmates. Before they die, most death row inmates get one final choice: a meal, a statement, maybe a last phone call. And you would think that in those final hours, people would ask for something meaningful, something peaceful, maybe even spiritual. But some of them order enough food to feed a small family reunion and then crack jokes about it, while others refuse to eat anything at all and use their last breath to promise the room they are coming back. So here are some of the most disturbing last wishes from death row inmates across America. Ronnie Lee Gardner.
Ronnie Lee Gardner is scheduled to become the first person executed by firing squad in the U.S. in 14 years.
Morning of the 2nd of April, 1985. A woman named Karma Hainsworth walked right up to a handcuffed prisoner in the basement of a Salt Lake City courthouse and slipped a loaded .22 caliber revolver into his hands. And that prisoner was Ronnie Lee Gardner. He was already facing trial for the October 1984 of 37-year-old bartender Melvin Otterstrom during an armed robbery at the Cheers Tavern in Salt Lake City, but Gardner had no intention of standing trial that morning. A corrections officer spotted the gun and shouted for people to run, and within seconds, guards opened fire and hit Gardner in the shoulder, but he kept moving, stumbling into a basement records room with blood running down his arm. Standing behind the door was 36-year-old attorney Michael Burdell, a Vietnam veteran who famously refused to carry a weapon even during his military service, and was at the courthouse that day doing free legal work for a fellow veteran. Gardner pointed the .22 and shot him through the right eye, and Burdell collapsed and died 45 minutes later at a nearby hospital. His fiancée, Donna New, had known him for 6 years, and they were planning their wedding, so she never got the chance to become his wife. Gardner then turned the gun on bailiff Nick Kirk, hitting him multiple times in the abdomen, hip, and leg. And while Kirk survived, his family later said the injuries left him suffering for the rest of his life. Gardner made it onto the courthouse lawn, threw the gun away, dropped to his knees, and pressed his face into the grass before being taken into custody. He was convicted of capital murder on the 22nd of October 1985 and sentenced to death. Gardner had been in and out of detention 12 times by the age of 11, born the youngest of 7 children in Salt Lake City, and his father left when Ronnie was still a toddler. Child welfare workers once found him wandering the streets alone and malnourished at just 18 months old. And by adulthood, he had already escaped from custody multiple times and had a robbery conviction from 1980. So when Utah finally gave him 2 choices for how he would die, lethal injection or the firing squad, Gardner picked the firing squad because he told reporters back in 1996 that he had lived by the gun, he had killed by the gun, and so he was going to die by the gun. His last meal was served 2 days before the execution because he wanted to fast in keeping with his Mormon faith, and he requested steak, lobster tail, apple pie with vanilla ice cream, and a 7-Up. And then on his final night alive, the 17th of June 2010, he spent his hours sleeping, reading a novel called Divine Justice, and watching the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy back to back, while prison officials described his mood as relaxed. Just after midnight, on the 18th of June 2010, 5 anonymous marksmen raised .30 caliber rifles from behind a curtained wall, and 1 rifle held a blank round, so none of the shooters would ever know for sure who fired the fatal shot. Gardner was strapped to a metal chair with a white target pinned over his heart and a black hood over his head, and when asked if he had any last words, he said he did not. 2 loud bangs echoed through the chamber, and he was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. at the age of 49. His family waited outside the prison in matching shirts printed with his prisoner number, 14873, because he had asked that none of them be inside to watch, since he did not want anyone to see him get shot. William Bonin.
William Bonin, a 34-year-old truck driver, is the man accused of being the freeway killer. Police say Bonin cruised the freeways of Southern California, picked up young boys in his van, raped them, tortured them, and killed them.
Between May 1979 and June 1980, the bodies of teenage boys and young men kept turning up along the freeways of Los Angeles and Orange County, and the press called whoever was doing it the freeway killer. The victims ranged in age from 12 to 19, and most were hitchhikers or young men walking alone at night who were lured into a green Ford van, sexually assaulted, tortured, and strangled with their own clothing. One victim, a 17-year-old German tourist named Markus Grabs, was stabbed roughly 70 times, and all but one of the others were killed by ligature strangulation. William George Bonin was born the 8th of January, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut, the second of three brothers raised by an alcoholic mother and a father who gambled compulsively, and as a child he was placed in juvenile detention where he was sexually assaulted for the first time. He served as a helicopter gunner in Vietnam, came home, and was almost immediately convicted in 1969 of kidnapping and sexually assaulting 5 boys. And after cycling through state psychiatric facilities where he was diagnosed as a sociopath, he was paroled for the final time in October 1978. He started killing within months, and his first known victim was 17-year-old Thomas Lundgren, whose body was found near a freeway on-ramp in August 1979. After that, the killings came one after another across the highways of Southern California, and Bonin had a small circle of accomplices to help him, all young men between 17 and 21 years old. His closest partner was a part-time magician named Vernon Butts, and another accomplice, 17-year-old William Ray Pugh, got arrested for stealing cars in May 1980 and started talking to police. Pugh told detectives that Bonin had bragged to him about being the freeway killer, and it turned out Pugh had actually participated in at least 2 of the murders himself, but the information he gave was enough to build a surveillance operation. On the 11th of June 1980, undercover officers followed Bonin's van into Hollywood and watched him approach several young men on the street before a 15-year-old boy accepted a ride. And when Bonin parked in an empty lot, officers rushed the vehicle and found him in the middle of an assault. Inside the van, they recovered nylon cord, knives, and a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings about the freeway killer. He was convicted in 1982 of 10 murders across Los Angeles County and sentenced to death, and a second trial in Orange County the following year brought 4 more convictions and another death sentence. Bonin confessed to killing 21 boys and young men total, though investigators suspected the real number could have been as high as 36. He spent almost 14 years on death row at San Quentin, and on the evening of the 23rd of February, 1996, after spending the day visiting with friends, Bonin was moved into the death watch cell around 6 p.m. His last meal was 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. So that is 18 cans of Coke for one man on his last night alive. At 11:30 p.m., the warden visited his cell, and Bonin gave his final statement, saying that he felt the death penalty was not an answer to the problems at hand and that it sent the wrong message to the youth of the country. He suggested that anyone thinking about doing something serious against the law should go somewhere quiet and think about it first. At 12:09 a.m., the lethal injection process began, and 4 minutes later, at 12:13 a.m., William Bonin was pronounced dead at the age of 49, becoming the first person in California history to be executed by lethal injection. Philip Ray Workman. When the Tennessee Department of Corrections asked Philip Ray Workman what he wanted for his final meal in May 2007, he told them he wanted a large vegetarian pizza delivered to a homeless person near the prison, and he did not ask for anything for himself. The prison refused because state policy did not allow taxpayer money to be used for charitable donations, so Workman skipped dinner entirely and went to his execution on an empty stomach. But when word of his request spread across Nashville, everyday people started stepping in to grant it themselves. A woman named Donna Spangler rallied her friends and raised $1,200 to buy 150 pizzas for the Nashville Rescue Mission, and the president of PETA, Ingrid Newkirk, ordered 15 vegetarian pizzas sent to the same shelter. By evening, homeless shelters across Nashville and then across the entire state were flooded with donations, and over 1,500 homeless people ended up eating pizza that day because of what one death row inmate asked for. Workman was born on the 1st of June 1953 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, into a military family, and he later joined the army himself before his life fell apart fast after his 1973 discharge. He picked up a burglary conviction in Georgia, served 25 months, and spiraled into a severe cocaine addiction that left him barely able to support his wife and 8-year-old daughter back in Columbus, Georgia. By the summer of 1981, Workman was 28 years old and desperate, so he hitchhiked to Memphis, walked into a Wendy's restaurant on August 5, ate a hamburger, and then pulled out a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol and robbed the place of $1,170. An employee hit a silent alarm. 3 Memphis police officers responded, and in the chaotic struggle that followed, Lieutenant Ronald Oliver was killed. Workman was convicted of first-degree murder in 1982 and sentenced to death, but the case was never clean. Years later, new ballistics evidence raised serious questions about whether Workman actually fired the shot that killed Oliver, because multiple experts concluded that the .45 caliber hollow point bullet Workman was carrying could not have produced the wound that killed the lieutenant. The evidence pointed instead to friendly fire, a round from another officer's weapon during the exchange. The only eyewitness who testified at the original trial, a man named Harold Davis, later recanted under oath, admitting he lied when he said he saw Workman fire the fatal shot, and 5 of the 12 jurors who sentenced Workman to death said afterward they would not have voted to convict if they had known this. Even Lieutenant Oliver's own widow and stepchildren publicly supported calls for clemency. Workman never denied the robbery, and he admitted to walking into that Wendy's with a gun, but he maintained until the end that his weapon went off involuntarily when an officer struck him in the head during the struggle. He had 6 execution dates set over the years and was moved to death watch 4 separate times before. The 9th of May, 2007. When the 53-year-old was finally pronounced dead by lethal injection at 1:38 a.m. at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. The execution took 17 agonizing minutes, and his final words were a prayer asking that no person be held responsible for his death. Even years after his execution, other death row inmates cited Workman's last request as inspiration, and in 2019, Tennessee death row inmate Donnie Johnson declined his own last meal and asked that the $20 be put toward feeding the homeless instead, saying Workman's story had inspired him. Aileen Wuornos.
Eileen Wuornos was a prostitute in Florida who robbed and killed 7 of her male clients in a 12-month span.
Between late 1989 and late 1990, 7 middle-aged men were found shot to death along the highways of central Florida, their cars stolen, their wallets emptied, and their bodies left in wooded areas or along the roadside. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born the 29th of February, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, and she never met her father, a convicted child molester who was serving time in prison when she was born and who later took his own life behind bars. Her mother abandoned both Aileen and her brother as toddlers, so the two were raised by their grandparents in Troy, Michigan, where Wuornos later said she was physically and sexually abused growing up. By 14, Wuornos was pregnant, and she gave the baby up for adoption before ending up on her own at 15. She drifted south to Florida in the mid-1970s, racking up arrests for assault, disorderly conduct, and armed robbery while living a transient life, and in 1986, she met a woman named Tyria Moore and began a relationship with Moore while supporting them through sex work along Florida's highways. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics shop owner from Clearwater, and Wuornos picked him up on a rainy night in late November 1989 along Interstate 75. His body was found 2 weeks later in Volusia County with 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. After Mallory, she went quiet for several months, but by mid-1990, the killings came fast, and over the next few months, she shot and killed 6 more men. David Spears, 43, Charles Carskadden, 40, shot 9 times, Troy Burris, 50, Charles Humphreys, 56, a retired police chief, Walter Gino Antonio, 60, a reserve police officer, and 65-year-old Peter Siems, a retired merchant seaman whose body was never found. Police caught a break in July 1990 when Wuornos and Moore crashed Peter Siems's car, and a witness gave descriptions of both women that led to composite sketches going out across the state. On the 9th of January 1991, officers arrested Wuornos at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Volusia County, and she confessed 3 days later. In court, Wuornos told the judge she was as guilty as it gets, that she had killed those men in cold blood, and that she had hated humans for a long time, and she was convicted and sentenced to death on 6 counts of first-degree murder. She spent a decade on death row at Broward Correctional Institute, and toward the end she fired her legal team, dropped all appeals, and wrote directly to the Florida Supreme Court asking the state to execute her. She told them there was no point in sparing her because she would keep killing if she were ever released, and in one of her final interviews in July 2001, she said she had hate crawling through her system and that there was no chance in keeping her alive. On the 9th of October 2002, Wuornos was moved to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison and declined a last meal entirely, because under Florida rules she could have ordered anything she wanted for under $20, but she passed on all of it and accepted only a cup of black coffee. And then came her final statement, where she told the room she was sailing with the Rock and that she would be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6, like the movie, the Big Mother Ship and all of it, and that she would be back. The lethal injection was administered at 9:41 a.m., and she was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. At the age of 46, the 10th woman executed in the United States since 1976. Velma Barfield.
Velma Barfield was convicted and sentenced to die in 1978 for the poisoning death of her boyfriend. She also admitted poisoning 3 other people, including her mother.
She had a southern drawl, crocheted dolls for members of her church, and earned a nickname that stuck with her until the end, Death Row Granny. But Velma Barfield was also a serial killer who used arsenic-based rat poison to murder at least 4 people, including her own mother. Born Margie Velma Bullard on the 29th of October 1932, in South Carolina, she grew up poor, married her first husband Thomas Burke at 17, and had 2 children before the marriage fell apart. In 1969, their house in North Carolina mysteriously caught fire while Thomas was inside, and he died while Velma collected the insurance money. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, fell ill and died less than a year into the marriage from what appeared to be a heart attack, but when his body was later exhumed, it contained traces of arsenic. In the years that followed, Velma took on caretaking jobs for elderly people and developed a severe addiction to prescription painkillers. So she began forging checks in her patients' names to pay for the pills, and every time she got close to being caught, the person whose money she was stealing would get violently sick and die. John Henry Lee, an elderly man she was hired to look after, was poisoned, and so was Dolly Edwards, a relative of her fiancé, and then Velma's own mother, Lillian Bullard. All of them were given arsenic-based rat poison mixed into their food and drinks, and all of them developed the same violent gastrointestinal symptoms, while Velma volunteered to nurse them through it, playing the devoted caretaker, while they slowly died from what she had put in their meals. She once told investigators she only meant to make him sick, not kill him, and she showed up at every funeral looking like she was genuinely grieving. Taylor was a tobacco farmer she had been dating, and Velma was stealing from him to fund her pill habit when she feared he was about to find out, so she mixed the rat poison into his beer and tea. When he got sick, she volunteered to nurse him again, and he died on the 3rd of February 1978. An anonymous tip led police to order an autopsy on Taylor, and when it came back positive for arsenic, Velma confessed to 4 of the murders and was convicted of first-degree murder in December 1978. On death row, she underwent a religious conversion, became a born-again Christian, counseled other inmates, and wrote letters of apology to victims' families. But when it came time for her last meal on the 2nd of November 1984, the grandmother who poisoned people's food could not face eating a full meal herself, so she asked for a bag of cheese doodles and a can of Coca-Cola. She walked into the execution chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh, wearing pink pajamas, while about 300 people protested the death penalty outside the walls, and a smaller crowd across from them chanted for her death. Before the injection, Velma released a statement saying she knew everybody had been through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and that she was sorry, and she was pronounced dead shortly after 2 a.m. at the age of 52. She became the first woman executed in the United States since 1962, and the first woman ever executed by lethal injection. Robert Alton Harris.
Tuesday's execution of Robert Alton Harris may have made capital punishment even more controversial.
Morning of the 5th of July, 1978, around 10:30 a.m., 2 16-year-old boys named John Mayeski and Michael Baker were sitting in a green Ford in a grocery store parking lot in the Mira Mesa neighborhood of San Diego, just eating hamburgers they had picked up. Robert Alton Harris, who was 25 at the time, pulled up alongside them with his younger brother Daniel, and Robert walked over to the boys' car, pulled a 9mm Luger from his waistband, and got in the back seat. The brothers forced the boys to drive out to a remote fire trail near Miramar Lake, a spot where Robert and Daniel had been target shooting the day before, and Robert told them the car was being borrowed for a bank robbery and that nobody would get hurt. Then he told them to start walking up the hill, and as they walked, Robert shot John Majewski in the back and fired a second round into his head. Michael Baker ran screaming into the brush and crouched down, but Robert chased him and shot him 4 times, then walked back to Majewski, put the barrel against his skull, and fired one more time at point-blank range. The brothers drove home, and according to court testimony, Robert Harris sat down and ate what was left of the dead boys' hamburgers while laughing about the killings. He mocked his brother Daniel for being too squeamish to eat, and flicked bits of flesh from the end of his pistol into the street. About an hour later, they used the stolen car to rob a San Diego bank and made off with roughly $2,000, but they were caught less than an hour after the robbery. In a grim coincidence, one of the arresting officers was Steve Baker, Michael Baker's own father, who did not realize his son was one of the murdered boys until later that day. And both John Majewski and Michael Baker were just 16 years old, just kids eating lunch in a parking lot on a summer morning. Robert Harris was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances on the 6th of March, 1979, and sentenced to death. Harris had been born into violence at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, arriving 2 months premature after his father kicked his pregnant mother in the abdomen, and both parents were alcoholics, with reports that Robert suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. He was in trouble with police by 10, placed in juvenile detention by 13, and abandoned by his mother at 14, and he spent 14 years on death row at San Quentin before his execution date finally arrived. On the 21st of April 1992, the night turned into one of the most chaotic in California's death penalty history because 4 separate stays of execution were issued overnight, and Harris was actually strapped into the gas chamber, removed after a stay was granted, and then strapped back in when the stay was lifted. His last meal was a 21-piece bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, 2 large Domino's pizzas, a bag of jelly beans, a 6-pack of Pepsi, and a pack of Camel cigarettes. At 6:01 a.m., he was escorted into the gas chamber for the final time, and among the witnesses was Steve Baker, the officer who arrested him and the father of one of the boys he killed, and Harris turned and looked directly at him. His final words were a line from the 1991 Keanu Reeves movie, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, that you can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper. At 6:07 a.m., the executioner pulled a lever that dropped cyanide pellets into a tub of acid beneath the chair, and witnesses said Harris began breathing deeply and puffing his cheeks in a gasping motion before his head dropped to his chest. He was pronounced dead at 6:21 a.m. on the 21st of April 1992 at the age of 39, and it was the first execution in California in 25 years. Carla Faye Tucker.
And there were absolutely signs all throughout my childhood that there was something wrong.
In the early morning hours of the 13th of June 1983, 23-year-old Carla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend Danny Garrett broke into the Houston apartment of a man named Jerry Lynn Dean because Tucker was furious over a dispute involving a motorcycle. Tucker and Garrett had been awake for days, high on a cocktail of drugs, and they went to Dean's place intending to steal the bike and parts. But what started as a burglary became something far worse. Garrett attacked Dean with a hammer, and Tucker grabbed a 3-foot pickaxe leaning against the wall and started swinging it into Dean, and she later told police that every time she brought it down, she felt a surge of intense physical sensation, a detail that haunted the case for the next 15 years. Deborah Ruth Thornton, a woman who had met Dean earlier that evening, was hiding under the covers in the bedroom, and Tucker and Garrett found her and killed her too, leaving the pickaxe embedded in Thornton's chest. Tucker was arrested on the 20th of July 1983 after a friend she had bragged to went to the police, and she was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder in 1984 and sentenced to death. Her family had broken apart when she was 10, and her mother became a sex worker who, according to Tucker, introduced her daughters to drugs and the streets when they were still young. So Tucker started using drugs at 8 years old and was following her mother into sex work by her early teens. But what happened after her conviction is what made this case unlike almost any other on death row. Because within months of entering prison, Tucker underwent a religious conversion. She became a born-again Christian, led Bible studies behind bars, married a prison chaplain named Dana Brown in 1995, and by all accounts was a genuinely changed person. Pope John Paul II, televangelist Pat Robertson, the United Nations, and even Deborah Thornton's brother-in-law, Ronald Carlson, publicly called for her sentence to be reduced to life. Governor George W. Bush declined to intervene, and on the 3rd of February 1998, Tucker was flown from Gatesville to the Huntsville unit for the last time. Her last meal was modest, just a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. She chose 4 witnesses to be present, including her husband, Dana, and Ronald Carlson, and on the other side of the glass, Deborah Thornton's husband Richard watched from a wheelchair. Tucker's final words were an apology to the families of both victims, and she told her husband she loved him, asked Ronald Carlson to give Peggy a hug for her, and said she was going to be face to face with Jesus and that she would see everyone when they got there and would wait for them. As the injection took hold, witnesses said Tucker licked her lips, gazed upward, and hummed softly before she coughed once, groaned, and stopped breathing. She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. on the 3rd of February 1998, at the age of 38, and her co-defendant Danny Garrett had been sentenced to death as well, but died of liver disease in prison in 1993 before the state could execute him. Carla Faye Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas since 1863. Cameron Todd Willingham.
He was convicted and put to death for murdering his children.
Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in 2004 for the 1991 murders of his 3 daughters by setting his house on fire with the girls inside.
4 days before Christmas, in 1991, a fire broke out in a small house on West 11th Avenue in Corsicana, Texas, and inside were Cameron Todd Willingham's 3 young daughters, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron. All 3 children died of acute carbon monoxide poisoning from smoke inhalation, and Willingham, who was 23 at the time, told firefighters he had been asleep on the couch when he woke to the sound of his daughter crying and that the hallway was already engulfed in flames. Neighbors found him outside screaming and trying to go back into the burning house. State fire investigators examined the scene and concluded the fire was arson, pointing to what they called pour patterns on the floor and evidence of an accelerant, possibly lighter fluid, placed deliberately to block the exits, and prosecutors argued Willingham set the fire on purpose to kill his own children. A jailhouse informant named Johnny Webb testified that Willingham had confessed to him while they were both in custody, and the jury convicted him of 3 counts of capital murder in August 1992 and sentenced him to death. Willingham never stopped saying he was innocent, and he refused a plea deal that would have spared his life because accepting it meant admitting guilt. He told his family he would rather die than say he killed his own children. But what came out after the conviction changed everything about how people saw this case, because fire science underwent massive changes in the years that followed, and nationally recognized arson experts reviewed the original investigation and tore it apart. In January 2004, just weeks before the execution, Dr. Gerald Hurst, one of the country's leading fire scientists, reviewed the evidence and concluded that none of it actually proved arson, because the so-called pour patterns could have been caused by the natural behavior of the fire itself. The supposed accelerant indicators were based on what Hurst called junk science, outdated folklore, and discredited forensic methods that had no basis in modern fire investigation. The Innocence Project later assembled 5 of the nation's top fire experts who produced a 48-page report reaching the same conclusion, and the Texas Forensic Science Commission launched its own investigation and acknowledged that outdated science played a role in the conviction. And in 2014, 10 years after the execution, newly discovered documents revealed that Johnny Webb, the jailhouse informant, likely received a reduced charge in exchange for his testimony, something both Webb and the prosecutor denied at trial. 5 of the 12 original jurors said they would not have voted to convict, but none of it saved him. On the 17th of February, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was strapped to a gurney at the Huntsville unit in Texas, and his mother visited him for the last time that day. When she began to cry after hearing the governor refused a stay, Willingham told her not to be sad, that in 55 minutes he would be a free man. His final statement, recorded by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, was that the only thing he wanted to say was that he was an innocent man convicted of a crime he did not commit, that he had been persecuted for 12 years for something he did not do, and that from God's dust he came, and to dust he would return. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. at the age of 36, and whether Cameron Todd Willingham was guilty or innocent is still debated, but the science that put him on death row has been thoroughly discredited by every independent expert who has ever reviewed it. Scott Dozier.
The Nevada death row inmate who had been awaiting his execution for over a decade has taken matters into his own hands. Scott Dozier was found dead this afternoon in an apparent suicide.
Most death row inmates fight their execution dates, file appeals, and beg for more time. But Scott Dozier spent years trying to get the state of Nevada to kill him, and the state kept failing. Dozier, born the 20th of November, 1970, in Boulder City, Nevada, was convicted in 2007 of the first-degree murder and robbery of 22-year-old Jeremiah Miller, one of his drug associates in the methamphetamine trade. On the 18th of April 2002, Miller met Dozier at the La Concha Motel on the Las Vegas Strip because Dozier had promised to help him buy ephedrine, a key ingredient in cooking meth, and Miller brought $12,000 in cash for the deal. Dozier killed him, sawed his body into pieces, stuffed the torso into a suitcase, and dumped it in a trash bin near an apartment complex in western Las Vegas. He was also convicted separately in Arizona in 2005 for the 2001 murder and dismemberment of a man named Jason Green near Phoenix, so that was 2 murders in 2 states, both involving dismemberment. After nearly 12 years on death row at Ely State Prison in rural Nevada, Dozier dropped all of his appeals in October 2016 and told the court he wanted to be executed. He told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that life in prison was not actually living, just surviving, and that if people were going to say they would put him to death, they should get on with it. And he even told the court he was willing to accept pain during the execution process and did not care how it was done. But Nevada had a problem. Because the state had not carried out an execution since April 2006 when Darrell Mack died by injection, and its supply of authorized lethal injection drugs had expired. Corrections officials scrambled to put together a new combination and landed on something that had never been tried before: midazolam, cisatracurium, and fentanyl, which would have made it the first execution in American history to use fentanyl. Dozier's execution was scheduled for the 11th of July 2018, but hours before it was supposed to happen, a New Jersey pharmaceutical company called Alvogen filed an emergency lawsuit arguing the state had illegally obtained its supply of midazolam, and a judge agreed and blocked the execution. A second attempt was also blocked in September 2018 after a Las Vegas judge found the Nevada Department of Corrections had acted in bad faith to obtain the drugs through deception. So Dozier sat in his cell, a condemned man who wanted to die, stuck in a state that could not figure out how to do it. And in the final months of his life, things deteriorated fast. He was placed on and off suicide watch repeatedly, and his family said he was stripped of his belongings and cut off from outside contact, while his lawyers filed court documents in December 2018, arguing that his mental health was crumbling under the conditions of his prior confinement. The state said it was responding to evidence that Dozier was actively planning to take his own life. On the 5th of January 2019, guards at Ely State Prison found Scott Dozier alone in his cell, hanging from a bedsheet tied to an air vent, and he was 48 years old. He never got a last meal, a final statement, or the chance to choose how he would leave, because the man who told the world his life was no longer worth living ended it himself, while the courts were still arguing about the drugs that were supposed to do it for him.